Did President Xi issue a veiled threat to President Trump right to his face, as many Western media China hawks are suggesting? In their opening remarks to each other, President Xi mentioned the Thucydides Trap in his opening monologue, and many China hawks took that to mean that the president was threatening Trump and the U.S. right to their face, right to his face, and he took it with a smile. So I'm going to let you listen to the entire phrase. It's not that long, and then we'll talk about it on the back end. Now, if you understand Mandarin, then go ahead. Otherwise, there's some problems.
开创大国关系的新范式，能不能携手应对全球挑战，为世界注入更多的稳定性？能不能着眼两国人民的福祉和人类前途命运，共同开创两国关系的美好未来？
Now, before we get into the monologue, let's just cover real quick what the Thucydides Trap is. It is a reference that was coined back in 2012, but it refers to the war between Sparta and Athens. Athens was the rising power. Sparta was the dominant power. They eventually went to war. They both lost, had terrible losses. Sparta came out on top briefly, but only to be then taken over by the Thebes. So it was basically a devastation for both sides. And that is the takeaway that you should have when anybody references the Thucydides Trap. That's the reason why it was coined in 2012, was to bring reference to the rising power of China and how it'll eventually be at war with the United States. And all of this is really coming to a head over Taiwan. Now, after reading this monologue, if all you did was zero in on the Thucydides Trap and not take everything else into context, then you're just as guilty as the rest of the Western media. An honest assessor of his monologue would see that he wants to move past what is past precedent, what is a historical outcome of the majority of rising powers. And behind me are those historical examples of major powers. This column is the current power, this column is the rising power, and what the outcome was. They either went to war or they didn't, and as you can see, a large percentage of them, the vast majority, went to war. Now, some notable ones that didn't go to war were in this century, primarily with the USSR and the United States of America. And that was what President Xi is trying to say, is can we move past historical precedent? Can we have a historical partnership? But that doesn't bode well for the China hawks that want us to go to war with China, as they bring in the fact that China also made a reference to, or rather President Xi made a reference to, there hasn't been this level of change in a century. And so whenever he talks about that type of change, he's referring to the rising power of China and how the U.S. should just hand the keys over to China. And all of this is just a misinterpretation in order to drive dollars and clicks and views. China wants to avoid war. President Xi wants to avoid war. That's what he is saying. But he also wants to protect China's interests. And their number one interest, their number one policy, is a unified China, and that includes Taiwan. And so if not for that issue, we would have a positive G2 on our hands, where two great powers would work interchangeably and together to keep and provide a stable world. And that should be the veiled message underneath this opening monologue, not some veiled threat that China is going to rise and America should just learn its place. And that's what the China hawks are trying to get you to believe, and they're just lying to you.